Okay, before I get started, just a quick question of you all. How many are economists or economics majors? A couple of you. Okay, well, you might be disappointed there's no economic model, there's no statistical regression analysis, there's no, like, hypothesis testing. Asia specialists? Actual Asia specialists, in some sense? Okay. Poli-sci? Or, okay. So you bailed on NAFAC. Okay. And librarians. Okay. Just trying to get a sense of the crowd. I'm trying not to presume too much underlying knowledge of the issues or of any particular methodology in the presentation, but if I say something we're just kind of going, huh, what is she talking about? Please feel free to stop me. I don't mind interruptions. That's totally fine. So if you have a question, ask it as it comes up. Without seeming to be hawking my book, I do want to say that if you do have more interest in the issues, this is where it comes from. Part of it is just to say there is actual analysis that's going to support all of my bold assertions. I didn't just make it up, but it's just not possible in such a short period to provide all the supporting documentation and everything that's behind it. So that's kind of my telephone book of proof that, you know, there is something more going on here. So with all of that, so what is Asia's stake in the global opiate market? And you'll note I didn't say heroin. And there's a reason why I didn't say heroin, because it's not all just about heroin. And particularly if you're going to think about it from the Asian perspective, that's a really important frame of reference. Heroin, definitely wealthier Western nations, that's how opiates are largely consumed, either heroin or morphine. If you get into the synthetic equivalents, which I don't work with, then you get some synthetic variations in the Western countries and occasionally in more so in Latin America now than previously. But if you're going to talk about agriculturally based opiates, the stuff that comes from the poppy plant, which is what I'm going to talk about, then if you're going to think about Asia, you need to be very careful to think not just about heroin consumption, but actual opium consumption as well, because opium itself is still a consumer good in Asia, and a fairly popular one as these things go. The work does derive from the book, but the book itself from a much longer term project. We started working on this project in 2002, we being I and Letizia Paoli. She's in Belgium, a sociologist and criminologist. Peter Reuter, he's at University of Maryland and was at Rand, where I was formerly. He and I have been collaborating for about 20 years now. And we worked on this project together. And we worked on this project together with a series of what we call collaborators across the world. And we started work, as I say, in 2002. Perhaps ironically, we received our initial funding from the Smith Richardson Foundation purely coincidentally on September 11th, 2001. That was the day that their committee was meeting in New York City to determine grants for the following year. And that was the day, apparently, they signed off on our grant. And at that time, we had a fairly narrow focus. Our interest was in looking at Afghanistan in particular because the year before, the Taliban regime had imposed a very strict ban on opium production and opium growing. And so there was a virtual halting of opium production from the country that had been the premier source. And it's very rare that an economist gets what we might call a natural experiment, where supply simply vanishes for a year, and you can see how the market evolves, responds, changes. Other people who have worked our work have likened it to the natural experiment of the petroleum shocks of the 70s. You just don't often get a lot of cases where the supply just vanishes for a period, and you can see how the response filters through. And so we were fascinated by this prospect. As time, lo these many years, went on, however, we really broadened our scope. And so this is not a book about Afghanistan. It's not a talk about Afghanistan specifically. It's really about the global market and where Asia fits into that. We did take a fairly interdisciplinary approach in our work, Letizia being the lead author, a criminologist and sociologist. I, having had policy-making experience, brought that perspective in. And our collaborators were from a wide range of backgrounds. From the enforcement side, we had some policing folks in China working with us. More the healthcare demand side, I think our collaborator in India is much more of that perspective. So a range of views coming at the issue. And trying, while looking specifically at supply-oriented policy, how do you stop supply, how do you stop trafficking, and what are the effects of that, thinking about the perspectives of the producers, the traffickers, and the consumers. That may be more intro than you really wanted. So the short answer, it's even bigger than you think. Asia's share in this market, its stake in this market, is immense. In some ways, not surprising. In other ways, a little surprising. What I'd like to do, and this is what I've given the handout, is talk for a few minutes about numbers, because I love numbers. And I think the numbers here tell the story in pretty compelling terms. Looking at both the supply and the demand side of the market, as an economist would say, I'm going to walk you through production, through trafficking, so that's the distribution, and through some consumption data to get a better handle on where Asia stands in this market. The piece of this that I think is not surprising is that Asia leads in production. I don't think anybody's going to be terribly surprised to hear that. If you've been following the newspapers, you'll see the statistics on Afghanistan's share of the market. It's about 92% by itself. If you throw in Pakistan and Southwest Asia, is about 93% of the global market on production of opium or from poppy. Southeast Asia has been playing a somewhat diminishing role in recent years. Burma is still the second largest producer in tonnage terms, but its role has diminished. In the last 10 years, its production has gone down by about 80%, fairly evenly over that 10-year period. What you don't see are the statistics for 07 and 08 here. If I were to now include them, because they are now available, you'd see that Afghanistan went from 6,100 metric tons of opium production, potential production, to over 8,000 in 07. In 07, perceived to be down considerably again in 08 into at least the 7s. The U.S. data tell a slightly different story. They suggest that Afghanistan's production has diminished by a larger amount, but I mostly here work with UN statistics. So Asia kind of owns the market in terms of production. The only way in which this might surprise some people in the U.S. is that our focus in the U.S. is often on heroin originating in Latin America. And so we tend to have a slightly Latin America-centric view when we're concerned about our own heroin consumption, and certainly with recent events in Mexico have become more so. So perhaps the total market picture is a little surprising to some people, perhaps not, but Latin America is really a very small share of the global market. Now, I have noted these data are from, I don't know if you can see this, maybe in your handout, UNODC, which is United Nations Office on Drug Control. And we work with their data throughout our research. But there's an important thing not showing up in here that makes Asia even more important than it seems, and that's that the UN doesn't report estimates of Indian diversion. Well, what's Indian diversion? Well, India produces large amounts of opium for the legal market, for pharmaceutical purposes. They are, in fact, I believe, the only officially licensed exporter of raw opium gum. Is that I sometimes get lost in the technicalities, but they are the ones who are exporting the same type of product that Afghanistan currently produces. Others use a slightly different technology. What we find happening in India, and what has turned out to be a real surprise in this research, is that the diversion from the legal market to the illegal market within India is really quite substantial and not well documented. And we have a separate paper that we came out with, I guess, a few months ago that provides some estimates on that. And what we believe to be the case is that about another 200 to 300 metric tons annually are diverted from the legal to the illegal market in India. So India doesn't blatantly produce opium for illicit purposes as these other countries do, but it's finding its way into that market. We don't believe it's getting exported, at least not in large quantity. India is itself a very large consumer of illicit opiates, and so it's largely to satisfy domestic demand. But if you believe it's a global market, that doesn't exactly matter, because they would have had to buy it on the world market if they weren't buying it from themselves. So we still view them as contributing to the world market. Does that change the shares? No, not really. Doesn't dramatically change our view of Asia, but it just says, hey, this is even more important to Asia than we think of it as being. It also says there's a little more on the market than we tend to think of, and that our third-ranked country is probably a country that nobody ever even talks about. And so it's an important issue from a policy perspective. So they rank third, likely, behind Afghanistan and Burma. Okay, trafficking. Trafficking is a tricky thing to talk about from a data perspective, because the only thing we really have to facilitate the discussion are data on seizures. And we view them as an incredibly crude approximation of data on trafficking. If it's seized, gee, we guess it must have been trafficked. And so we can at least get some handle on where we think product is flowing, how it's moving across borders. And we can do actually some very interesting mappings. If there's time, I can show you later. We did this where we were actually able to map paths of flows of opiates as they wend their way around the world and get a handle on sort of who's involved as middlemen. But what the seizure data tell us, and what I've got here are sort of selected nations that are very heavily involved, and their average seizures for a 3-year period, because seizures are very, we call lumpy in the data, in that, no puns intended, in that you can get a really big seizures one year, very little the next, really big, kind of medium. There's not kind of a smooth path to look at in the annual data, and so 3-year averages are a good idea. And so we looked at 3-year averages here and basically found that most seizures are occurring in Asia, defined in various ways. These are just some numbers I singled out. In particular, what we see is that, perhaps not surprisingly, seizures, trafficking are most often happening in and around the nations that are producing the drugs. They kind of go through the neighboring country and then move onward, sometimes not making any further stops, sometimes just one stop en route. And so you see very high seizures in Iran, Pakistan, Tajikistan, within Afghanistan itself. And most of the Afghanistan seizures, we believe, but I honestly have no proof to support this, are more to do with trafficking than seizures at the production and farm level. We just don't see a lot of that happening in a seizure database. That we see eradication showing up, but within the seizure database, it's mostly product moving around. At least that's our belief. More recent UN data, because again, this ended at 2005, and UN always lags, I believe, 2 years in their data sets. I think 2006 is the most recent I can still talk about, or I have to talk about. I think they said Asia writ large is about 80% of global seizures for 2006 alone. So fairly indicative. Now, another thing here that's kind of interesting, though, is Tajikistan. Why is Tajikistan interesting? Tajikistan is interesting because 10 years ago, they weren't involved in this market. Not really. There was just nothing happening there. And within about a period of about 10 years, Tajikistan went from being not particularly involved to being unbelievably involved. We believe that if you look at drug trafficking as a share of the nation's economy, after Afghanistan, they're probably the nation most dependent on illicit drugs on the planet. It's really quite extraordinary story. And it's not just economic dependency, it's dependency in other ways in so much as the political system has become intertwined with the trafficking. And it's very difficult to disentangle what's happening in the drug markets from what's happening in the rest of the country, both economically and politically. And this happened very, very rapidly. Why did it happen? Most people seem to posit the growth in demand in Russia had a lot to do with it. Suddenly a lot more need for product to move northward out of Afghanistan. Tajikistan occupies a border that's very difficult to patrol. Product moves easily, both sides. So a nice conduit for product to Russia, and either staying in Russia or in some cases moving onward to Europe, but largely about satisfying the burgeoning Russian demand. Yeah?
Could you give me some idea about the production level? How concentrated is production? I mean, you see fields of poppies out there, and you say, well, it's just a big, a lot of farmland. It's obviously widely distributed. And
yeah,
does it all have to come together for production?
No, not at all. Not at all, actually. Production can be fleeting. I mean, production in the sense of transformation to heroin. Farm-level production, there are hundreds of thousands of households involved. A lot of small landowners, increasingly some big landowners, too, within Afghanistan. In Burma, mostly, I believe, it has been small landholders. I'm not as sure about Burma now. And so many hundreds of thousands of market participants at the farm level. The farmers produce the actual opium. The transformation of opium to heroin is not a technologically difficult thing, maybe village level. We aren't exactly sure what's happening in Afghanistan. There's been a push towards consolidation among the middlemen. I had breakfast with somebody earlier this week who's an Afghanistan specialist who said at this very middle trafficking level within Afghanistan, she imagined there were a couple dozen active entities, whether it was individuals or their families. It used to be much more than that. So there's been a bit of a trend toward consolidation. But it's not like a high-tech industry. It's pretty straightforward stuff. The other trend within Afghanistan is towards the actual processing in Afghanistan. When I first started working on this in 2002, it was mostly just opium. and it was going to get shipped out through Tajikistan as opium, or it was going to go across the Pakistani border and get transformed in some way and then move on. Much more today, though, the heroin is produced within Afghanistan. They've kind of moved up the value-added chain. And as economists, we often think of that as a good sign for an economy. In this case, not so much. It's something gone awry. So the market is changing. Consumption. This is the piece that I think surprises people. If any one thing here surprises people about the market, it's the pattern of consumption. I think, at least, there is an idea that floats through the world, that, at least the Western world, that opiates are about Western consumption. They're about heroin, they're about New York City, they're about San Francisco, they're about London, they're about Paris, they're about a lot of things, but that they're not about developing countries, and they're not particularly about Asia from a consumption perspective. That turns out not to be true. On a tonnage basis, on a share of population basis, this is largely a story about Asia. If we look at prevalence rates, which are defined as the percent of population age 15 to 64 that have been using opiate over the past 12 months, I think that's how this is determined, you find that you multiply out by the actual number of persons in each country that fit that description, and that within Asia, over 50% of the consumers, there they are, okay? 53.9% for the years we were looking at here. These are very sketchy numbers, the prevalence rates. They move around a little bit. Nobody's exactly sure, but they're indicative. They give us a sense of what's going on. If you make some adjustments for different modes of consumption within countries, some of the Asian countries consume a little bit more on a tonnage basis because they're consuming more opium than heroin. It's a little less efficient, so in poundage it can account for a little bit more. And a few other adjustments along the way, because some of the prevalence rates we're not quite sure about, you eventually come to thinking that over 60% of consumption is in Asia. So again, a little loosey-goosey, but that's about where you land. Not highly disputed. This isn't a controversial thing that I'm saying. You open up any UN annual report, and you're going to see this, just not the thing people are really thinking about in the daily discourse on the issue. Now, the thing to keep in mind, though, is that while we've largely defined this as an Asia thing at this point, right? Production is Asia, trafficking is largely Asia, consumption largely Asia. Value is not largely Asia. The value is not within Asia in the sense of how many dollars is this market worth. The value is in the Western countries. Anybody have any idea why that might be? I can't help it to be professorial.
It's harder to get it there?
Yeah. There's a risk question, right? Every time you cross a border, you're incurring some risk. And when you cross a border into a consuming nation where the policing is pretty good, the risk starts to get very, very high. And then as you move from these bulk, or not necessarily bulk, but the slightly larger quantities into the street level quantities, you know, various risks are being incurred and incurred and incurred and incurred. And so by the time you get to the actual street level, the value is immense in pure dollar terms after you've made all the risk adjustments relative to what it was at the farm gate. So you could think of it as a shipping cost and an insurance premium, perhaps. I mean, there are a lot of different ways an economist might want to model it. But the bottom line is the farm value of Afghan opium, about 2% of the retail value of the opium and its derivatives. At most, 2%. Recent statistics looks like it's diminished a bit because price has gone down. This was based, I think, on 03 and 05 data. The opium price has really sunk in the last couple of years as production has gone up, not so surprisingly. The export value, so that's after some processing and after some within Afghan transfers from one person to another, maybe about 5% of the retail value. Not sure that it's changed very much. I thought it might have gone up a bit because the processing has gone up, and you might expect that. But the most recent numbers I looked at yesterday didn't really look all that different. And then just kind of an indicator of how different the retail markets are themselves, because it's not just about the difference between production, wholesale, and retail. It's the geography of the retail as well. A retail price of 1 gram of heroin in Tajikistan in 2003, I believe, was between $1.30 and $2.60, purity adjusted. So it's same purity basis compared with 116 in the US, and the same quality and grade, roughly. I think one was like heroin 3 and one was heroin 4. So there's a slight difference there, but not a huge difference. So roughly the same product, roughly, and roughly the same purity. and that's the price difference. So there's a huge value difference. So Asia is not capturing nearly the value. That doesn't make them any less economically dependent, because you're dealing with a group of countries that don't have a lot of alternative sources of income at the moment. So even if the numbers look small by Western standards, still enormously important. For Tajikistan, for example, we estimated that trafficking was equivalent of about 30% or more of their legal GDP. Afghanistan, recent estimates are, I think, 40% or more. So these are huge shares of their economies, just not huge share of the opiate economy. So important to keep in mind. So summarize a couple unexpected findings from an Asian perspective from our research. The idea that India would be the third largest was really stunning to us. We did not expect that. And I've sort of walked through the numbers before. The idea that Tajikistan had gotten so terribly drawn into this was also a surprise to us. We didn't see that one coming. We knew they'd become more involved, but the extent of the involvement, this 30% of GDP, was really stunning to us. And again, our research on that is a few years old, but every look I've had at the more recent numbers suggests it has not changed all that much. The other piece, and this isn't completely obvious in the numbers, but they're buried in there, is that Asian opiates play a substantial role in the US market, and possibly a larger role than Latin American opiates. First, how do we know that? It's kind of arithmetic. You go through and you look at how much is being produced, you look at how much is being seized, you look at how much is being consumed. The numbers just don't add up in a way that makes it possible for Latin America to be our main supplier, for most of our opiates to come from Colombia and Mexico. They just don't produce enough. We consume too much gets seized. Even if you imagine all the seizures get pumped back into the market, still the numbers don't add up. I mean, there's just nothing you can do to torque these numbers to make them work. Why is it a surprise? Well, because many publications that you will see, US government, other governments, if you look in the press, you will see claims that Latin America is really our primary source of opiates. And it's just become popular wisdom, I think. You know, it's kind of the way we think about it. I think another piece of it, to be fair, is a data piece, and that's that they do a lot of, there's a thing called the Heroin Signature Program. They do sampling of seizures, and I think they're able, where they're doing the sampling and what they're able to ID, a lot of it comes up as being Latin American. So there may be a data bias there. But when you just do the arithmetic, it just doesn't really seem to work. And so from a US perspective, Asia matters more than we sometimes think that it does. We just simply can't be buying everything from Latin America. On the other hand, pretty much everything Latin America produces is coming to us. That part I'm not disputing. If you're producing in Colombia, you're producing in Mexican, odds on your heroin, if small amount might be staying in Latin America, but the lion's share of it is coming north. So from that, in that sense, there's some truth. So what, if anything, can we do about this? And how am I doing for time, by the way?
We have 20 minutes.
Okay, all right. So some lessons for policymakers, and then we'll try at the end to bring it back to Asia, because I have to admit our policy thinking was a little bit broader. 3 lessons, and we'll talk about them in a little more detail. Effective production interventions, I'm going to define effective in a moment, are possible, but they require some long-term perspective and a fair amount of institutional and financial support. Trafficking, not a lot of opportunity there to do much. Disrupting trafficking is not going to pan out necessarily as a good policy option. Some limited option there. Strict enforcement of supply-oriented prohibitions, they can reduce societal harms. You know, clamping down can reduce societal harms. But quick turnabouts, a rapid change from lax or non-enforcement to really heavily enforcing can be very, very costly. I'll talk about each point in more detail. So what constitutes an effective production intervention? I think in our minds coming out of this, we have come to accept that you may be able to do something at a national or regional level. You may be able to do something locally, but you're not going to get a global reduction in opiate production, not easily. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind as I talk about the rest of the policy options. We're primarily thinking locally at this point. Essentially, You try to stop it in one place, the so-called balloon effect kind of takes charge, and we do find production pops up elsewhere. There are a lot of places that can produce opiates, a lot of places that have sufficient chaos to support it, and economic need, so it's not that hard to imagine replacements when one producer goes. It may take a little time, maybe an adjustment period, may cost a little bit more, but when you see that farm level cost is 2% of retail, you can imagine that a little bump up in production cost isn't going to be the thing that drives this market. Nevertheless, even if, and part of the reason why we got to this is because the title of our book was, you know, the world market, can supply be cut? And that's essentially the question we set out to answer with this research. And ultimately, our short answer on that one was no, not really. But that doesn't say abandon hope. There are things you can do locally to improve the situation, and I think you can make a strong case that it's worth doing that. We'd like to believe that Thailand is better off without opium growing, that the nation benefits from not doing that. So there are benefits to be had locally, defined as region, nation, province, not necessarily the world. How do you go about doing this? Well, what we've observed is that there seem to be two very distinct approaches with a little bit in the middle. What we call the draconian approaches, and those are the approaches, say, of the Taliban in Afghanistan, the WA in Burma, who just say basically, you are going to stop now, you know, or maybe we'll kill you, or we probably will kill you, so stop now. And that's the very draconian approach to banning production. And we have seen it, and we've seen it work in Afghanistan for a very short period of time. Who knows how long it might have lasted had the Taliban stayed. People imagined it probably wouldn't have lasted all that long, though. In Burma, over a 10-year period, still taking a fairly draconian approach, they have really brought production down. I have, and you may see reports in the press of, oh, you know, it's kind of on the rise again. It has increased somewhat in the last 2 years, but by no means to prior levels. And again, a little decrease in the most recent year. More democratic societies typically are needing to take a slightly longer term strategy. And I was thinking about this as I was looking at the slide this morning. It's like, wow, Burma, that's called draconian, and it was 10 years. So what do I mean when I say longer term? I'm saying really long term. Thailand, decades to get out of the business. It takes a long time to reform an economy to sort this mess out. This isn't an easy thing to do. Hopefully, decades, plural, wouldn't always be necessary, but you really have to have a long-term perspective. This isn't there's no quick fix here. And part of the issue is this notion of entrenchment. If this is what your society has grown dependent upon, it's very hard to back it out. And so interestingly, Colombia got very into the market for a period of time, appears to be a little less into the market now. And one of the reasons that some have posited that it's been able to make some turnaround is that it really wasn't as entrenched. It started, it stopped, relatively brief period of time, didn't become part of the social fabric. Whether that's true or not, I really can't tell you. Not a Colombia specialist, but boy, worth pursuing. Anybody wants to write a research paper, something to think about. Trafficking, we're very pessimistic coming out of this work that you can do much to stop the supply through trafficking interventions. Basically, those who traffic are those who are neighbors, you know. And so at that point, if you want to stop trafficking, you either have to stop production or you have to stop consumption. But it seems as if trafficking routes are incredibly robust. Once they're there, they're there. Maybe not the exact specific route, you know, which street and which airplane, and maybe we go to mini subs and we used to do a different kind of boat, but the basic route seems to be somewhat invariant and very, very resilient. Also very much pulled together by existing demographic and economic ties. We certainly see that with Pakistan and Afghanistan. They have a very long-lived tradition of smuggling across the border. You know, they've been doing this like forever, smuggling back and forth. And so it's well-established relationships. We see this really throughout the whole global market. A lot of it is about relationship. It's an illicit market, so relationships are established. So these are things that are hard to stop. I mean, it's hard to sever those demographic and economic ties. It's hard to sever ties created by patterns of immigration, by patterns of trade. So not a huge amount of success coming there unless you can stop the production or the consumption. The one exception to that, and this is a slightly nuanced point, and I may not spend too much time on it, is that what we did find is that the global market is, because of these trafficking routes, highly segmented. And so it's a global market, but you do see certain patterns of movement of product. And because it's so much based on relational capital, getting to know each other, networking, it can be difficult to turn on a dime and to change that relationship and to change that pattern overnight. So if you have a situation where one market is clearly served by another in a very particular way, you can potentially disrupt it for a short period of time before it gets a chance to regroup. And in that disruption, you might be able to have some effect. We believe that may have been the case in this recent, what we call heroin drought in Australia in 2001. Drought not in lack of rain, but in lack of available heroin. It being a very isolated market, there was a brief period about a year, in which heroin just wasn't getting into Australia the way it had been. There simply wasn't any heroin. And in that circumstance, you may see some current users getting themselves out of the market. They may be going into treatment. It may stick, it may not stick. You may see some would-be users who never enter the market. And because they never enter, you have a longer-term effect. You actually have an effect on the demand curve itself. It's not just where are you on the demand curve, but the demand curve of the future looks different than it otherwise would. But these are very limited opportunities. This isn't how you solve the global problem, but it's one limited way in which you can make a difference. Strict enforcement. This is, I will have to say, this is my co-author's work. This is the sociologist piece. And so I'm not sure I'd fully do it justice, but I find it fascinating. What we found in a cross-country analysis is that strict enforcement of the law, okay, so how we enforce our laws, how a nation enforces its laws, can, in fact, help the situation. Perhaps that shouldn't be a shocker. It can prevent consolidation of large illicit enterprises. It can reduce some of the drug-related violence, some of the corruption. You know, you look at strictly enforcing countries, they're typically looking better than others, and maybe there's a bit of a chicken-egg issue and all of that. But the thing to be careful about in making that observation is that if you want to go from being a non-enforcer to a strict enforcer, it can look very ugly in the interim period. So while it's good ultimately perhaps, or perhaps not in the global scheme of things, to be a strict enforcer, given the current legal state of play. And actually, I don't want to seem to be advocating for strict enforcement, sort of given our global regime as it is, given the current state of play. It can do some things for you, but to make that turnabout can be very, very hard. And while not an expert in all things Mexico, or even a few things Mexico, one can imagine that that's a piece of what's going on there. You know, when you take out the leads and you leave a vacuum, you get this unstable period, you get a lot of people juggling for position, and it can get very, very ugly. So to be very careful in viewing strict enforcement versus non or lax enforcement. And I think the other piece of this is it's not just a country saying, gee, I think I'll become a strict enforcer today and everything will be okay. You need a fair amount of institutional support to make this happen. You need some institutional infrastructure. Your political system has to function. Your police have to function. Things have to function that aren't necessarily functioning in the countries that we're most concerned about. So to summarize, basically, Asia just dominates this global market in all ways but value. Tajikistan, India, more involved than we imagined. Asia, more important to us than we typically think. And that there's a very limited set of supply-oriented policy options that might be able to have some local impact, but globally not so much. What does that mean for Asia? I would say that probably for Asia, the story is not likely to change very much for Asia writ large, because it's just too big an entity. You know, you stop producing in Afghanistan, you can look to other Turkmenistan, you can look to Kyrgyzstan. The other stands, so to speak, were in fact opium growers in the past. They just aren't anymore. Growing conditions there are pretty good. Turkmenistan, we don't really know what happens in that country, and that could be a country that could enter this market potentially. There are a lot of other places that could be growing within Asia that to imagine stopping it in Afghanistan, that you will stop it in Asia, probably not very likely. I suppose it's possible if you could stop it everywhere there, maybe it moves itself to Africa, but that would be a much longer transition period. But there are countries there that are geographically suitable and have sufficient corruption and sufficient lack of political infrastructure that you could imagine a hospitable environment. So maybe you can get it out of Asia, but it's hard to imagine. So maybe you can help Afghanistan, not clear you can help the entire continent. That's it.
Very good. We have 15, 20 minutes question and answers, so.
Yes, Doctor. I'm interested particularly in Southeast Asia and the drops that have happened there.
Yeah.
You mentioned the WA in Burma, but across the map you've had two countries that don't even register on the scale anymore.
Yeah.
And then Laos also has had a significant drop. Why is that?
Well, there have been some pretty active development efforts. Thailand has been a very conscious effort. Thailand made a decision that it was not going to be an opium grower anymore, and it stopped, basically. Though this past year there has actually been a resurgence in production in Thailand, but still quite small relative to the whole. And the global community has helped to some extent. The UN's been pretty active. A lot of development projects, a lot of community level development work, grassroots support for stopping. And some guns. You know, it's not all happy glad, it wasn't all kumbaya, but a stopping, a decision. Laos, I think more recently, a development effort. I know less about Laos. Laos is kind of an interesting country because they were largely producing for domestic consumption as well. So I don't know how tied it is to a domestic consumption picture, but not supporting their trade balance through this. Burma, the WA just said we're not doing this anymore. I mean, you can be a bit cynical about it because they do produce rather a lot of synthetic drugs. And so they, not so much on the opium growing, but it's not like they stopped with the synthetics. So it's not as if they have gotten themselves out of the drug trade or out of other illegal markets, but a conscious decision not to be producing anymore and imposing, as we said, some fairly draconian measures to stop it. But I think there's another piece which, as this goes on, we'll have better data to explore. It's just that as Afghanistan's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, there's kind of a question of just market presence and, you know, is there room for them in the market anymore? They're not low-cost producers, and so it's questionable.
I was obviously intrigued by Afghanistan because Afghanistan accounts for about 90% of the entire world's production of opium.
And they used to more or less split it with Burma. Yeah, I think in my data columns I did include the 1988 because I just couldn't resist the temptation.
That's huge. Obviously, Afghanistan is a very special country to the world right now. I'm just wondering, if you have such huge production, there must be some kind of organized crime groups, like New Mexico drug kingpins. Does that in any way affect the central authority of Kazai, or is there any way the international?
Yeah, I'm not an Afghanistan expert. Okay, I mostly actually focus on a lot of the farm level issues, being my background.
How is production and distribution organized?
It's not particularly well organized. It has become slightly better, so to speak, or worse on the distribution side. I think, I said earlier, the colleague I talked to said that maybe now there are like 20, I don't know if it would be warlords or families or how exactly the vocabulary would go that you use to describe, that have big roles in the market. But it's not like Colombia 2, 3, 4 or Mexico 2. It's a much broader range, but it has shrunk down. It used to just be very fragmented and chaotic, and it was just village by village and district by district. And it's only in the last few years that we've seen any consolidation at all. How much has it corrupted the government? There's mixed opinion on that. There's really mixed opinion.
Does this consolidation in Afghanistan have to do with improvements that have been made in the transportation infrastructure?
I don't know. Can't answer that question. Can't answer that question. Yeah. You didn't get to say anything yet. Go on, you.
In Afghanistan, is the production similar to how they were doing it in Burma, with the warlords pretty much taxing small-level farmers for opium supply, or is it just large-scale, just kind of like my farm produces opium? There's two things going on in this. In Afghanistan, traditionally, it had been smaller farmers. We do see some evidence of some slightly larger farming systems developing. The taxation issue is sort of separate from that, in the sense of, in Afghanistan, there's a long-standing tradition that at the village level there are taxes paid on agricultural production. I believe it's 10%. And so whatever it is that you're producing, whether it's wheat, apricots, or opium, it is subject to this certain amount of taxation. Who's collecting that tax at the moment, I can't tell you, but in the past it had been sort of the local leader.
when the Taliban cut production by 90%, what took that? What filled that vacuum? What were farmers going with?
Actually, nothing particularly for the 1 year. Yeah, basically not a whole lot. In terms of filling the void of opium itself, two things happened. Interestingly, in the north, the northern regions, Badakhshan increased its production, but not nearly enough to fill the vacuum. But to the extent that opium was produced in the north. It was kind of an interesting little historical note, because Badakhshan had not been all that involved in opium production. The North had not been until this happened. This gave the North an opening to get into the game. In recent years, the last year or two, they seem to have pulled back again. So it's just not such a hospitable environment for growing relative to Helmand and Kandahar and others in the south. But in terms of filling the production void, we aren't aware of much filling it at all. And this was a huge poverty problem, because then when the Taliban were gone, you had a bunch of farmers in need of income in a hurry and something to fill the void. They had debt that had accumulated on crops that hadn't happened, because there's an advanced credit system that operates locally. So it was really unfortunate circumstance. So not much turns out to be the answer. So the other point then is, had this ban continued, it's not obvious how long it could have gone on for, with the absence of foreign assistance and aid and something to come in to help farmers, get back to something else.
Obviously, you're economist, not a sociologist, but have you looked at the cultural acceptance and I guess, the social acceptance, and whether or not these countries such as India would ban it without pressures from the West? Like, is it socially acceptable enough within their culture that without our pressures, there wouldn't be that much?
I don't know. That's a tough one to answer. If you are interested in this, I can tell you something you can have a look at that you might find worth reading. The United Nations goes around each year and actually surveys poppy growers in Afghanistan and asks them why they do or don't grow. And one of the questions is cultural. A couple of the questions are cultural. And you do get responses from farmers as to why they're not growing it, and quite a number of them say for cultural reasons, that they just believe that it's wrong. So it's not that nobody thinks that way, Really what that amounts to in the totality of the market, I can't tell you. But it was an interesting read. I just found this recently and thought, I'd kind of like to look into this a little bit more. There was some question over here, I thought. No? Okay. And then I'll get you, sorry.
With the decrease in opium production in so many countries as a result to Afghanistan raised opium production, has their production completely shifted over to synthetic drugs and other drugs? Like, has the market compensated itself with the new?
Not necessarily. I don't know what the data are on Burma. It's so hard to know anything about Burma. Right? I mean, it's just a tough country to know anything about. Thailand has been active in drug markets in other ways, as smuggling through trafficking, but I don't know how active they've been as synthetic producers. I believe they are involved, but I don't have the data at my fingertips. I'm afraid we're getting out of my core competency here. But I don't know that it's been a one-for-one. Pakistan, I don't think, has entered into another drug production universe. But then again, Pakistan has come back into this one. So that's the other thing that's a little bit worrisome. When you look at the numbers, the UN people will declare a nation as being poppy-free, and then a couple of years later, they're back. Pakistan, poppy-free. Well, they're back. They're not back the way they were, but they're back. And so there's a tendency for positive move forward to reverse itself if market conditions permit. And so it's hard to, you have to really look at broad sweeps of time.
Concerning sort of the land itself, has there been much research done into what other sort of vegetation you could grow, and perhaps something? I mean, it didn't look like it was too expensive. Obviously, they have a much lower standard of living, but $1.30 a gram.
Yeah. Actually, we do know a lot about agricultural alternatives for Afghanistan. In a prior life, Afghanistan was quite the lush agricultural nation. Notwithstanding drought, some pretty hideous mountain region growing conditions. There were some pretty fabulous conditions as well. There's a mix of terrain. They are well suited and have grown considerable quantities of wheat in the past. That's always a tricky commodity because on global markets you're really at the whims and mercy of commodity pricing, and it can be a challenge. They were very well known for their orchards and vineyards. Apricot, I think maybe fig, almond for sure, and vineyards. I mean, some really impressive agricultural commodity, range of commodities, some really beautiful product. Getting back to that has become more challenging. And I was yesterday, actually, I get into some of these things before presentations. I go online and see if I can find something new and interesting. And I found something old and interesting, which was an agricultural study that had come out from one of the World Bank umbrella entities that works with cultivation in dry land areas, and it talked about the schedules of planting, and it just becomes so clear where some of the problem is that there's a direct agricultural competition between growing the wheat and growing the opium, growing certain crops and growing the opium. They're happening at the same time, and they're happening in a way that makes intercropping and multi-cropping difficult. Other things are happening in ways where you can actually do the opium and then do something else in between the rows, or scatter things around your acreage. But for some of these things, it's much harder to do that. And so you're really having to make an either-or decision. On the opium side, you have something that's not very perishable. The farmer can, literally put it in a black plastic bag and store it under the bed, and it's going to last for years. And so when they need some income, they go to the opium bank under the bed and pull a wad and sell it, possibly more reliable than the local currency. And it's not going to go bad. You grow some of these other things and you have to worry about product going rancid. Wheat has some staying power, but you get into some of the other products and it can be more challenging. I think apricot and almond hold some appeal because once you dry them, they will last for a while, so you get some durability out of that as well. But so various people have come in with different proposals. I heard somebody talking melons the other day, and I said, well, that's a good idea in the sense that you can intercrop, and it's a quick one. You plant a melon, and you've got it right away. There's no startup period. Almond, apricot, pomegranate, you got a few years. You got to wait, maybe even 5 to 7 years before they're really in the productive swing. Melon instantly. Melon rots. I mean, anybody here buy a cantaloupe and leave it on the kitchen counter at home? Watch your mom do this, and it's like, oops, we forgot to eat it yesterday. Today we have to throw it out, right? So this is a problem, particularly in a hot climate, So building the infrastructure to support the alternatives, getting that certainty in the picture, getting the credit in the picture, getting something reliable, it's a challenge. But it's not for geographic reasons necessarily. So actually, one last thing on that, interesting current events. Terrible drought problems in Afghanistan last couple seasons brought the price of wheat up. And so in those regions that have been able to grow wheat, there's been a resurgence of interest because the price has come up enough to potentially make it worthwhile for them, those that can and have the water.
What's the State Department's position? I know DEA has its people over there in Afghanistan and are trying to stop it. But is the State Department also on board with that, or do they see it as destabilizing Afghanistan politically even more?
At this point, I don't know what the State Department's views are. I'm sorry, I just can't answer that.
Opium, this is about opium and religion. Marxists say religion is opium of the people, but it seems like there are a lot of people in Afghanistan who are farmers. There could be more of the traditional religious believers here. How do they square that with their growing of opium? Is there a relation?
My very superficial understanding of this is that poverty is poverty, and there's a need to feed the family. You have to eat at some point.
A bit of a political science question.
Sure.
It seems that you have this strike going from Iran through Afghanistan to Pakistan to India, where you have production and consumption. I was surprised. What surprised me was the amount of consumption in Iran and India.
Huge.
Two ends of huge.
Yeah.
Huge. Okay, on the two ends of this fulcrum in the middle of production. When they talk about the multilateral problems of in politics in this area. How does the opium production fit into this? Not knowing these little bits of market information, it never occurred to me that, you know, producers in India might not be all that happy about increased production in Afghanistan, and attempts to reduce consumption in Iran might affect the way they look at Afghanistan production. I don't know how these things fit in.
I'm not exactly sure how to answer the question, but there's been some interesting reporting in the press the last week or two that Iran has wanted to come to the table and engage the global community in discussions about poppy growing in Afghanistan because they see what's happening in their own country as a consequence, and the consumption and the trafficking effects. So it seems to potentially be bringing somebody to a conversational table that hadn't been terribly interested in being there previously. So some recognition of the market dynamic. I will say the data on production in Iran, or rather on consumption in Iran, we're not absolutely sure that the numbers are that big. There are big problems in the collection, there's big problems in the analysis, but I don't think anybody's going to dispute that Iran has a very big problem. India, the numbers are somewhat controversial. Our collaborator in India was not so happy with the prevalence rate that we were using from the UN, saying it was much lower, but then we saw a number of subsequent studies that seemed to support what we were doing. I think the problem you have in India is you just have so many people that even if you apply a low prevalence rate, you still get to a very big number. That's sort of the issue in China. China's prevalence rate is one of the lowest in the world, but you multiply by 1.3 billion people, or whatever share is between the ages of 15 and 64, and you suddenly have a really big number. So we have to be a little careful. We try to take the numbers with a certain grain of salt, but they give us an indication. One last, okay.
I apologize for drawing you out of your specialty.
Go for it. But, makes me think.
Those numbers for Iran, we mentioned earlier where authoritarian regimes often, you know, can effectively cut opium consumption.
Can effectively cut production. They're much less successful in consumption. China may have had some success in the 20th century in that regard, but we don't have a lot of evidence beyond that. Consumption is, I don't work on that side of the market, but what I know of it is just so challenging that different nations have tried so many different approaches of dealing with this, and somehow or another having a very difficult time getting traction.
One note to that is about consumption in China. One more problem, the government is having a problem dealing with the opium in southwestern provinces of China, Yunnan, Guizhou, and Sichuan provinces. Is there is a exuberant upsurge of culinary culture. People have ways of cooking all these different dishes to sell to customers. People eat out more. And one of the ways those road restaurateurs do is to add opium into some of the dishes. And to begin to and this was a major problem in the mid-1990s. You go to Sichuan, go to Chongqing, my hometown, and you have this hot pot. Do that. And this might be one of the victims here. And they added a big sauce on the opium, and there was a major crackdown later on because more and more people get eating those sort of things, and of course there is a medicinal addition to that, the drug. That's one of the problems.
Had not heard that before. I'll add that to my list of anecdote. Okay.
We're running out of time. Well, thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. This is actually obviously a very, very interesting, exciting topic.